Okay, so you can see the screen there. Yeah, got it? Clear? Okay. Okay, so we've been learning about Tuma, ritual impurity, primarily one that is sourced from a corpse. That's the focus of our Tumat Meit. What we've learned is that ritual impurity naturally spreads, and there are ways in which that spread will transmit from one place to another, from one entity to another. We also learned, and that's what we focused on the last 2 days really, is that it can contain impurity, and that something beyond that containment won't be affected by it. We called it ohel, right? That which covers. So if there's it creates a space between. But what happens, and this is going to be the subject of today's chapter, is what if there's an opening between two areas that contain within it, one of them contains within it ritual impurity, okay? And what we're going to learn is that there are, depending on the function and the size of that opening, that will determine whether or not Tumah is transferred from one room to the next room, or from one area to the area outside of it. So he begins with the following rule. He says, impurity does not enter a shelter, nor does it depart from it, if there is an opening less than a handbreadth by a handbreadth. So a handbreadth is like this. And if you have a handbreadth squared, if you notice you've got two rooms next to each other, and in the wall there is an opening, but it's smaller than that, impurity will not transmit. As the Rambam himself says, what's implied when there's a window between one house and another, or it could be two rooms, or between a house and a loft, meaning it can be either be two rooms side by side, or one above or one below the other. So if it is a square, handbreadth by handbreadth, and there's impurity in one of them, then the second one also becomes impure. But if that opening, use the word window here, but if that opening does not comprise of a handbreadth by handbreadth, it's smaller than that, then the impurity does not transfer. It doesn't depart from the one room into the other room. But he clarifies, when does this apply? He says that's with regard to an opening that's made by a person for a functional purpose. In other words, you use it to pass something through it, or you use it for the need of that open space. By contrast, if a window is made simply to allow light in, right? So you create a hole in the wall so that light can come in, then impurity can transfer through that space, even if it's only the size of a pundion. Now, what's a pundion? A pundion was a relatively large coin, but it's smaller. We don't know the exact size, but it's smaller than a handbreadth by a handbreadth. So again, if the opening was made as a functioning opening, like for example, to pass things through it, then the size is a tefach by a tefach. If the opening was created just to allow light in, not for any other function, then even a smaller size will allow impurity to transfer through it. So he says, how does it transfer? What's implied? If there was impurity in a house and a person came on the outside of the building, right, and stood next to that opening near the window, or he placed a vessel there, or he put something adjacent to the wall that covered from that hole, an area, right? So then the person, the vessel, or anything under that covering will become impure because the impurity passes through that small opening. A window made for light is one that is not covered by a roof, but instead is open to the sun. So he's making it clear. Basically what he's saying is that, it must be an outside wall, essentially. It can't be an inside wall where there's another covering on the other side of that room. Otherwise, it's not considered an opening for light. We're talking about an opening that will invite in the sunlight. Okay. When an aperture was not made through intentional human activity. So in the first one, we spoke about where you created that opening either for a function or to allow light in. What if there's this opening now and it wasn't intentionally made there? It gives examples. Either it was hollowed out by water, or other type animals, rodents ate through a piece of the wall, or the earth itself created, or if you had a window that had been shuttered and now the whatever was covering it was removed. So you never made that intentionally for your use, not for light and not for function. Or it was being covered by glass and now the glass broke. So now he says that particular opening, the minimum measure is the full span of a shingle, which is the size of the head of an ordinary man. So this is the biggest kind of opening. And anything smaller than that, as if he's in this instant, if these openings came about for any of the reasons we've just discussed here, if it's smaller than the size of a large ordinary man's head, it will not allow the tumah to pass through it. The above applies, provided the owner did not think of using that aperture for functional purposes, right? So now, in other words, if a natural hole occurred or an animal created that hole, so long as you have no use for that hole, then only if it's the size of a large head will tumah pass through it. But if you see that hole there, and now you decide you want to use it for something, or you decide that it's great for the light and you're going to keep it there. So if however he thought of using it, then the minimum measure is an opening of a handbreadth by a handbreadth. So although you didn't create it for that, but then we judge it just as any other opening that was created for function. And if in his mind he thought he'll allow it to stay there because he wants light to come in, then it's judged like any hole that was created for light, and as small as the size of a punyan would allow tumah to pass through it. The rationale is that in these instances, thought is considered equivalent to deed. This is a very powerful statement with the Rambam. What he's saying is that your intention actually creates the reality. So if you had a wall and a rodent came and made a hole in it, and that size of that hole was as size of a large head, if you had no interest in that hole, nothing will pass, the tumah won't pass through it if it's smaller than the size of a large head. But if you think, look, the rodents just created a hole, wonderful, I'm going to use it to pass stuff through it. So if that happened, then even if it's smaller than the size of a large head, but it's bigger than, or at least the size of a tefach by a tefach, then tumah will pass through it because your intention creates the reality. Halacha 3, the following rule applies when a person began closing a window open for light and did not complete the task. So you had a window and now you decide you're closing it up, but you didn't finish it. Either you didn't have enough cement, or somebody called you away while you were doing it, or you were doing it on Erev Shabbat and Shabbos comes in, you couldn't finish it. So he says, if there remains a small amount open, the question is now, how much space would ritual impurity pass through? He says, if a portion, the height of 2 finger breadths and the width of a thumb breadth remain, it conveys ritual impurity. So a very small kind of size. If it's less than that, it's as if it's closed and nothing will pass through it. Okay, halacha 4. The following rule applies when there was a large window made for light covered by a lattice or the like. So you've got a big opening, you created for light, but you've got like window shape, you've got this lattice work in that hole, right? So he says, if there was one place where there is a hole as large as a pundion, it conveys ritual impurity, allows ritual impurity to depart. If the holes of the lattice are small and there's not one hole that is the size of punyan, it's considered as if it's closed. What he's really saying over here, the Rambam, is that we don't measure the combined open space of all those holes. So if you've got a lattice work where there's no individual opening larger than a punyan, it's as if it's closed. No impurity will transfer. Similarly, when there was a large window made for functional purposes and it was covered by a thatchwork covering or shades, if there was empty space, a handbreadth by a handbreadth square, then it would convey ritual impurity and allow for ritual impurity to come in or go out. Otherwise, it's considered as if it was closed. So although the big opening is larger, if you've got some type of lattice work or you got something else or thatch work that's in between, then you would have to have an individual space the size of either punyan when the intention is for light, or the size of a handbreadth squared if the intention is for function. Halacha 5, when a window is exposed to the open air, its minimum measure is the size of a punyan. Avya means a window means an opening, right? Because it's made solely for the purpose of light, as we've explained. But if one builds, so now you have your outside wall and you drilled a hole to allow light in, and it's the size of a punyan, so purity and impurity impurity can transfer both out and come in, right? Now, if one builds another room outside that window, and now the window is under a roof, right? That opening is no longer exposed directly to the sunlight. So it's considered as if it's between two structures, and it's measured, and as it will only allow tumah to pass through it if there's a handbreadth by a handbreadth of empty space. And if the roof, now let's say you had a big window and you created a new room outside that window, and the roof only covers part way of the window. So then you would measure the lower part of the window, which is under the roof. It would have to be a handbreadth by a handbreadth minimum in order for the impurity to pass through it. And the upper part, because the upper part is still exposed to the sunlight, then even if there's the small enough, the size of punyan, it would still allow the impurity to pass through it, because the upper part is exposed to light and is judged accordingly as something that is a hole to allow for light. Halacha 6. The following rule applies in the situation to be described. So let's say there's a hole in a door, or a carpenter left an empty space above or below. You put in a door, and above or below the door there was space, or between two swinging doors there's space because it wasn't adjusted that they closed completely. So, or if you close the door and then the wind blew the door open. In all these situations, if the opening was the size of a shingle, which is the amount that we spoke about earlier, the size of a large head, the impurity leaves through this opening and enters through it. If the opening is less than the size of the shingle or the large head, it's considered closed. Okay. And the final halacha, as we mentioned, it's a nice short chapter today. When a person makes a hole in a wall in order to place a rod or large nails there. In other words, you're not using it to transfer things through it. You want to place something in it, but obviously the hole must go all the way through. Or you're making a peephole so you can see who's going out, or to speak to his colleague. You're making a little hole so that you can communicate. So he says it's considered as a window made for functional purposes, and its minimum measure is a space of a handbreadth by a handbreadth. Its function doesn't only mean when you're passing something all the way through it, but it could be to store something, it could be to look through it, it could be to communicate through it. It would always still be considered functional, and therefore, if it's the size of a handbreadth by a handbreadth, it would allow Tumat to pass. Anything smaller, it would not. Okay, that brings us to the end. Let's do the questions, and we can see how we fare, as it were. First question. Okay, if a window was used, sorry, I'm just going to make sure I can see everyone and so we can get some answers. If a window is used for transferring things from one structure to another, if a window used to transfer was covered by a window shade, does it block impurity from one structure from entering the other? One second, I got to read that slower and understand that question. Okay. If a window used for transferring things from one structure to another was covered by a window shade, does it block impurity from one structure from entering the other? Okay, so let's think about this. If there are many small holes that together would make up a handbreadth of space, it does not. That's one option. Second option, if there's an empty space the size of a handbreadth, it does not. No, a window shade is not a solid barrier and it does not block impurity.
I think a handbreadth, number 2.
Right, because
number 2.
Because we're talking not about a space that was there to allow light in. We're talking about something that was set up for function. It was a little bit of a tricky question, the way it was worded. Okay. Question 2. How large must a window used for light be to bring Tumat through it? The size of a punyan, a handbreadth by a handbreadth square, the size of the head of an ordinary man.
The punyan.
Correct, right? The first one. So, yeah, and that's obviously, that's the smallest size. It's a fascinating idea, firstly, Tumat, it's not so relevant to us today, but I found, because we've had the experience with this pandemic, and we've learned so many ways in which, there's disease transfers and different ways that we try to protect ourselves. These halachot are a little bit more easy to learn. And as what we learn is there are certain ways in which something can transfer, there's certain sizes through which something will transfer, there's certain, depending on the material, will it transfer, it won't transfer. So this is obviously not a physical thing, but there's some sense of appreciation, because it's like, depending on what you created the space for, it's either going to allow Tumat to transfer or not, depending on the size. So if you make an opening for light, then a very small hole will allow Tumat to transfer. But if you make an opening for functionality, then it would have to be slightly larger before it can allow Tumat to transfer. Anyway, it's very fascinating. Halacha 3. Does a hole in a door bring Tumat through its opening? So he said, no, since the hole is undesired, it is as if it's closed. Yes, if the hole is a handbreadth by handbreadth square. Yes, if the hole is the size of a shingle.
Mhm.
Either
I
2 or
think-
3.
I think number 2.
I'm
Two.
going
I'd
with
also go for 2.
I'm
Okay,
going
I
with-
think we go with
3.
3, right?
Yeah. Up.
Because it's comparable to, I guess it's somewhat similar to, it's yes, but somewhat
Sure.
similar to the first reading, because under Zai, now that you remember we said a whole that naturally occurs, meaning you didn't create it for a particular purpose, not light and not to transfer, has to be a larger size before Tumat can pass through it. So the same would be by a door, where that hole is most likely unwanted, right? And therefore, you would have the most lenient kind of approach to it. Now, what is if a peephole is made in a wall? Does it bring Tumat through its opening? So he said yes, if it's the size of a punyan, yes, if it's at least a handbreadth by a handbreadth, yes, if it's at least the size of the head of an ordinary man. So peephole is
Depends what you're peeping.
I
And number
Depends
2.
what you're peeping at.
2. I'd also go
number
for
2 is correct, right? So it's similar to
Yes.
function. Although the original understanding of function is you're going to pass something through it, to look through something or listen through something would be the same idea. Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Shkach.
Thanks,
you.
Rabbi.
Wrap it up there and have a beautiful day further. We'll see you next week.
You too. Nice to
Thank
see
you,
you
Rabbi.
again. Bye-bye,
Thank
Rabbi.
you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.